right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Talks at Google. In this talk, we'll be talking about the technology ecosystem and the entrepreneurship ecosystem in general in Africa. We have the pleasure today to be joined by 4 entrepreneurs who have built businesses in Africa, ranging from financial services, from media, education, and market research. The goal of this talk is to help us to better understand the technology ecosystem in Africa and the role a company like Google could be playing through the diverse eyes of our guests. So first on stage, let me introduce Greg Cohen. Greg is a co-founder and COO of Asoko Insight, Africa's leading private company data platform. As COO, Greg drives Asoko's product development, data acquisition, and data management operations. Prior to Asoko, Greg spent several years as a market research manager and analyst operating across Africa and the Middle East, including Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Algeria, Oman, and Bahrain. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
Next on stage, I'd like to introduce Eyitemi Popo. Over the past few years, Eyitemi has launched 3 ventures aimed at changing the African narrative globally and amplifying the voices of Africans. She is the founder of Ayiba magazine, which is an award-winning African publication that tells stories of the African diaspora, and GitGirl, which is Africa's first data science academy for women designed to teach African women skills in data science, data engineering, and data analytics. Welcome, Eyitemi. Next on stage, I'll introduce Abbey Wemimo. Abbey is a co-founder of Esusu, which is a financial technology company that helps people save, build credit, and provides a bridge to financial access and inclusion. The company's name is derived from the Ghanaian Twi language word susu, which means to plan. Now, susu is a form of rotational savings among family and friends that has been around the world for centuries. It allows people to advance financially and overcome the constraints of poverty. Welcome, Abbey.
Thank you.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Michael Rain onto the stage. Michael is a co-founder of ZNews Africa, a media and technology startup that publishes stories about the global Pan-African community. ZNews Africa was a selected member of Google's Launchpad, Facebook's FB Start, and Microsoft's BizSpark accelerator programs. Michael is also the creator of ENODI, which highlights the lives of first-generation people and immigrants of African, Caribbean, and Latin descent. He's also a TED Fellow, and his writing, photography, and film work have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, and Upscale magazine. So welcome, Michael, and welcome to all of our panelists. Great. So it's good to have you all here. Thank you for coming once again. I think we'll dive straight in. And I'll first start by asking each of you a couple of questions. You can take that opportunity to share with us a bit about what you're doing and address the question, and then we'll do some general questions before opening it up. So let's start with you, Eyitemi. With GitGirl, you focus on young women. So if you could share with us what the state of women in technology is in the countries you work in, and why you focus on data science, as you tell us more about what GitGirl does.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Eyitemi. I am the founder of GitGirl, which is Africa's first data science academy for women. Right now, we're operating in Lagos, Nigeria, and we've enrolled about 100 students. We plan on expanding to Ghana in the summer, and our goals are Pan-African, so hopefully we can get to that point. We decided to focus on data science because we felt like data is the next transformational trend in technology. It's already a huge trend here in the US, and it's picking up speed in different countries in Africa. And when you look at engineering, for example, or software engineering, women are not represented in tech on the continent. Even around the world, the stats aren't great. And so we felt like if we could go to something that hasn't yet hit, and we can prepare African women to have that first mover advantage when it really comes in, then we could win, because the idea is to economically empower African women. And if you go into a tech hub in Lagos or Nairobi, you will find women there, but they're likely, in digital marketing or web design. They're doing the non-tech things, and we wanted to give them high-value technology skills because that's what pays. And if we really want to give African women skills that actually pay the bills, then we have to teach them careers, prepare them for careers of the future. So that's what we do at GitGirl.
Okay, great. And so far, I believe you've done about two or three mentorship sessions in South Africa. I know you're planning on going to Kenya. Can you give us some insight about what happened in those programs? How was the interaction like? What was the experience for the young women you were working with?
Yeah, so that's a separate business. That's my magazine. So I actually found out about GitGirl through my magazine. It's called Ayiba, and we highlight change makers across the African continent, and that's how I met my founder. But through that, I also have a female focus, so that's kind of the thread in my career. Everything I do is focused on female empowerment. So with that, I bring my magazine to life because the magazine is focused on Africans in the diaspora, and I want them to be able to experience the continent. And so we do curated trips where you can go to Ghana or South Africa or Kenya, and while we're there, we're mentoring young girls. And so what I do is I bring girls that are interested in tech, and the women on the trip are high ambition women with great careers, and we give them role models. We show them what's possible, because sometimes you live in this tiny bubble, you're in a township in Soweto, you've never seen a professional woman that's living independently and is able to provide for herself. So just giving them that example is really powerful. And that's actually why I joined GitGirl, because as I've gone around to different countries and I've worked with young girls, I see how early it starts. I see how early they lose their confidence. And so if we can start training them younger, I feel they'll be more successful. So right now, GitGirl does focus on a slightly older demographic, because that's who can afford our fees, even though they're highly subsidized. But in the future, we do plan on expanding younger so that we can get them when it matters.
Fantastic. Picking up on the thread of media, I'm to switch over here to Michael. Now, Michael, you've built a career around storytelling and media. So could you tell us a bit about the mission of ZNews Africa, some of the work you do with other initiatives like ENODI, and some of the personal work you do? What's the why behind it? Why is it important, and what are you trying to convey with the work you do?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a storyteller and have been since I was a child, from illustrating little comic stuff to being a writer and telling stories for companies, and that's just my strength. And at some point, about 6 years ago, I decided to focus that storytelling on my people and my community, right? So it started with ZNews, which was a media tech company that I co-founded with a friend of mine from college. And our goal was to expand the stories about Africa beyond the war, poverty, and disease stories, which dominate all of media. To give a platform for us to tell our own stories and to make it easier to find all of those stories instead of searching around or depending on all of these email lists that I'm sure a lot of you are subscribed to, and to just make it easier. So we have a mobile app that is basically a flipboard for African news that aggregates from over 170 publications in English and French and organizes it by country and topic. That's only on Android, and since we're in Google, I guess that's cool. We also used to have a weekly email newsletter of curated content and producing original content. ENODI, which I launched a few years ago to focus specifically on first generation and immigrant people of African, Caribbean, Latin descent, was about the Africans outside the continent, the people in the diaspora who are connected to the continent and want to be connected but live outside of it. So that's starting mostly on highlighting stories of individual people, but we'll also be highlighting stories of entrepreneurship with immigrants. So here in the US, most people don't know that almost half of Fortune 500 companies were founded by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. And we also focus on cultural innovations of immigrants. So salsa was actually invented here in New York by Latino American immigrants. And even hip hop, the roots of that stems from Caribbean immigrants in the Bronx. So that's our our stuff. So on the tech end of that, I'm actually starting a fellowship at Stanford this fall, where I'll be focusing on improving local news for immigrant communities using SMS technology. So I'm sure any of you who have parents here in the US might have a smartphone, but they're probably not on Google and Twitter and all those things. They're in WhatsApp and some other messaging platforms. So the goal is to provide them and serve them with quality news.
And the readership for your different publications, and it sounds like there's a diversity of publications you've been working on. Are these mostly people in the African diaspora, people in Africa, people that want to learn more about Africa? Can you give us a sense of?
Yeah, so the app is probably 80% people on the continent. Even though it was originally built with folks like us in mind, those were the users that gravitated towards it. The newsletter it's like flipped. 80% of people are here all over the US, but also in the UK and Canada and in France. Yeah, so that's kind of how that's split.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so as we, oops. Sorry about that. Yeah, as we talk more about, the metrics, right?
Sure.
Of the different things you're working on. Greg, let me turn this over to you as the market research expert here. So you have been in the market research space for some time now. Could you tell us a bit about Asoko? Give us some insight into the world of corporate data, market data in general in Africa, and how you came about doing what you do.
Sure, it's a very challenging world. We founded Asoko Insight about 5 years ago. I've been working across the continent and the Middle East for a while doing market research. And Africa is the last continent where it's extremely difficult to get information on companies. And from an investor's point of view, a corporate that's looking to enter the continent, a government that's looking to do programs on the continent, it was very difficult to identify who are the companies in this particular value chain, in this particular sector, who are their owners, who are their managers, et cetera. So we decided to build Africa's most comprehensive private company data repository, similar to the way that a Thomson Reuters or a Bloomberg user experience would work here and in other developed markets. So we got VC-backed, set up offices across, I think at this stage we're in about 10 African markets across East and West Africa, headquarters in Nairobi and London. And we have teams that partner us with key data repositories in each of these markets. Most of the data is not online, so we have to funnel that data from credit reference bureaus, tax authorities, corporate registrars' offices, a whole bunch of private sector associations. We pull whatever is online, if there is any, and then companies also submit their information to us because we connect them with investors. So all of that data is quite messy. We normalize it, put it on our API, and then offer that to investors, banks, governments, et cetera. I think the catalyst of why we wanted to do this is there's a lot of really amazing technology going on across the continent when it comes to the retail side of things. Fintech is as you all know, is probably the booming story when it comes to innovation on the continent. I just got back from Kenya yesterday, and you're seeing these new tools that will provide automated loans to people based on their spending habits. So they don't even need to communicate with the bank; they just get money based on their spending habits. Pretty impressive. But as soon as you get a step up from there, we call them the missing middle, the middle market, kind of below the IPO multinational companies, and above the the mom and pop shops and the SMEs, you have this missing middle market. Companies that are making a few $1 million in revenue, need to grow, but are unable to access any capital. World Bank puts that number at about 330 billion of finance that's missing for these types of companies. And this is a big reason why the continent isn't developing as fast, as the access to credit, the access to finance is very difficult, not only on a personal level, but at a business level. So our goal is to profile all these companies, enable them to be marketed to anybody that's looking to do business, whether it's intra-African or global. Yeah, happy to get into other questions when we get into it, yeah.
Great. So in my mind, getting data from Africa seems like a pretty challenging effort for a variety of reasons. Could you one, maybe validate that. Is that the case? And if so, what makes it particularly challenging?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, the regulations when it comes to data is very nascent. And that's also a big opportunity because there's not as much legacy legal frameworks, and you have some very innovative technocrats that are now, telcos are becoming banks and banks are becoming telcos, and there's a lot of interesting regulation coming out now that's adhering to a lot of the new technology. But at the same time, it's new and people don't know how to handle it. And the way that it's captured and structured is still being figured out. So a lot of the repositories that we need to get information from are still hard copy. They're in archives. They need to be digitized. That's a huge effort, costs a lot of money. So we've had to negotiate ways to get that at wholesale. And it's been a challenge. Each country has its own unique nuances, as we all know. Kenya has been at the forefront. Nigeria has been very difficult. Yeah. But we're making progress, and I think that overall the environment is becoming more conducive to knowing that there needs to be solutions here. If companies want investments, the governments need to provide enabling environments. Registrars are starting to digitize. I think in Kenya now you can register your business through a phone. So you're seeing the right track. Rwanda's ahead of probably a lot of Western countries. So country to country, it has different stories. But the challenge is to standardize and normalize that, because our clients want to look at Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tanzania and compare the same data points together for their analyses, which is very difficult to do. Yeah.
Okay. Now, somebody who perhaps has a lot of this data in a digitized form that could be ready to be consumed by by Greg is Abby, right? So you work on Esusu, which is a digital platform for savings. Could you tell us a bit about the model and how it works and why it works the way it works? It seems like it's a very innovative model in terms of the savings model. It leverages communities. Could you shed some light on how it comes together?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll be remiss without, first of now talking about the inspiration behind the idea and, how far we've come, and then the expansion, aggressive expansion into the African continent. So, I grew up in the slums of Lagos, Nigeria, and, one thing I was afforded was one of the best education. And throughout that experience, it was a good one, being able to really be thought-provoking about what's going on in the landscape. And I had the opportunity to come to the United States and, I had the experience to work in different banks on Wall Street and in corporate America. And one thing that was striking during my transition, and my mother and I, was when we immigrated from Nigeria to the United States, in shivering negative 22 degrees weather in Minnesota. Wasn't fun at all. One of the biggest things was we didn't have a credit profile. So we didn't even have access to capital, which was a struggle. So the alternative was to go through payday loan lenders, which is very synonymous to what's going on the continent. I would like to call them neo-payday loan lenders, and we'll get to that during the course of this conversation. So the main factor there was, we got high interest rates, which was, insane, and we tried as much as possible to, make ends meet. So after my stint in corporate America, my co-founder and I founded Esusu, which is really based on the premise of capturing relevant data and unlocking the financial potential of folks. So right now, there are over, for this 45 million people that are acute, in the United States specifically, there are over 500 billions of loans accessible to them. And when we look globally, especially some African countries, and compound the market opportunity there are over $10.3 trillion of capital waiting to be unlocked. That's a lot of capital. So the inspiration behind what we did was leveraging a century-old idea on the African continent and bringing innovation to a place like the United States, getting a lot of pedigree and doing it right, and now looking to and expanding across the African continent, specifically in Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. And what we're doing there is really, like Greg talked about, gathering people's, payment activity, looking at their debt to equity ratio when we look at their bank accounts and giving them access to capital that way. So it's data driven. It's not a derivative of, who your father is or who your uncle is. It's actually, how you're keeping your personal finance and having that lens of being data-driven to allocate capital. So when we think about the data we capture, it's a lot of powerful information. So personal identifiable information is one, accounts to how people think about their balance sheets on a monthly basis. And then their payment history, which is quintessential to making lending decisions. So, we have a wealth of data, and, right now, the biggest, the most exciting thing, and we should talk, Greg, is working alongside, the Minister of Finance in Ghana to actually see how we can create a credit rating system there. So, the access to capital won't be the derivative of, who your father knows or your uncle knows. Is actually a derivative of, what's going on in your balance sheet and everyday life. So that's what we're trying to address aggressively.
Yeah, amazing. And Abby, you talked about taking a centuries-old idea, something that has worked in Africa in terms of communal savings, and using that to influence the service that you offer.
Right.
And perhaps I'll just open this up to all of you on the panel today. When you think of building products, right, for a consumer base that is primarily in Africa or interested in Africa, what are some of the differences, if any, in how you structure the problem, how you think about the problem, how you design your solution?
So for me, since I work in the educational technology space, I find that education should be very context specific. And this may be because I'm a bit salty about my, high school education in Nigeria, where we focused on the Queen and had this colonial education 60 years after we fought for independence. And so I bring that into how we design our curriculum at GitGirl, making sure that we're not just taking a curriculum that already exists, in the US and transplanting it there, because it doesn't make sense for our students. And if we were to do that, then they could just sign up for an online education program in the US. So what makes us different is that we're designing for a very specific audience. We're designing for African women. And the first thing is we have to realize, since it's an online program, internet in Nigeria is very expensive. The speed isn't always there. Electricity isn't always there. And so because we understand this, that dictates how we set up the timing and how we make sure that our students are able to give their all, because it is a very self-directed learning program. And as Greg can tell you from living in Lagos, it's not an easy place to live. It's very stressful. You have a lot of traffic. So understanding the time constraints, you build that into how you design. Also understanding the finances, right? So our program costs $300 for 3 months. So that's $100 a month. That doesn't sound like a lot. It's probably the cheapest you'll find, but it has to be at that price because we know that our average student earns about $300 a month. So even though that's quite well off for Nigeria, they're allocating a third of their salary to us. And so we have to have financing options so that they can afford it. We have to have scholarships and grants available. So those are the type of things that we fit into our design. When it comes to the fact that we're serving women, especially women in tech, we do know that there might be a confidence issue, right? So if they were to sign up for a course here, they're in classrooms with probably majority men. In America or in India, if it's an online course, they might not ask the questions that they really want to. And so part of our curriculum is also creating a community that is able to motivate them to just keep at it. We get Instagram posts with people saying, this looks really cool. I want to try it out, but I don't believe I can do it. Give me some information. Tell me that you believe I can do it. And we have one of our lead instructors who is actually based in the US, and she does an amazing job. She's a computer science graduate, and she knows what it's like to be the only woman in the room, the only Black woman in the room. And so having someone that has that empathy and can constantly encourage the students to do their best because she knows what it's like to be overlooked and underestimated really matters. And so we could have just created this data science academy that's just like the rest, but we had this opportunity to develop something that was exactly for our audience, the African woman, and that's what we've done.
I'll go next. I think I'll frame the question in the context of a B2B scenario for Asoko because we don't focus on consumers. When you look at a lot of the global corporate research and data providers, particularly in Europe, they're based on structured data sets, the availability of structured data sets coming out of a regulator or the listed equities markets. When you look at Africa, the markets that we're operating in, the data sets are very unstructured. So the way that we've architected our system is based on how do you accumulate unstructured data sets and normalize them. So it's a bit of the inverse compared to the companies that we've compared ourselves to in Europe. And what that means is we have to focus a lot more on quality assurance and use a lot more of a human-in-the-loop style system where data comes in from a variety of random sources. That goes through an increasingly semi-automated quality assurance process where we can pick out the bits that need polishing, the bits we want to reject, the bits we want to accept, to generate a clean data set. And when you look at other firms that do these types of things in Europe, their systems aren't built in that way because they haven't worked in those types of environments. So I think that's kind of what emerging market, and it's not just Africa. I mean, these are any markets that just have nascent data and repositories. So that's kind of at the genesis of how we did it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just chime in real quick. I think when we think about data structures, the key facts we need to think about is really open and machine readable. Right. The question is, how do we get there? The data we're having right now is very unstructured. The transition to machine, readable and open, we need to have a data clearinghouse that essentially, like, if you want to make, kind of before you get to the Asoko Insights of the world, there's an interim market play there where you can have a lot of folks essentially just cleansing data and making sure it gets to that point of open and machine readable. One thing that's important to underscore is we need to work with institutions because they really, really matter. They might not have, the kind of data we have right now, or, it's not particularly useful. But the more investments we have working alongside those governments to set the frameworks to make, the data more palatable to our customers. We also operate on the B2B end, selling some of our data to, financial institutions. So we really, really need to bridge that gap from open, machine readable, have a very, very good data clearinghouse that can interact with the government to make sure there's a sense of verification. And one thing that's also crucial to have there is policy, because one thing that's troubling for me, especially on the continent, going to Kenya and Nigeria, yes, loan is accessible, but people are not paying back, and there are credit rating agencies everywhere now. And what that's doing to people's credit scores is, setting us back, 60 years again.
I'll just say for us, so we think about the users a lot, particularly with our app, which has a robust cache, so you can read news even if you're offline because data is expensive or you might get cut out of electricity. We also think about building mobile first, truly mobile first, because a lot of us take for granted all the other computers outside of our laptops and our phones that we're using. Even if you use an ATM or if you're in a store using a scanner or something, this is not available to a lot of people. So it truly has to be a holistic experience on your phone. And we also go off feedback. A lot of American companies here are constantly trying to get feedback, engage people in studies. Lucky for us, Africans will tell you exactly what they think. You don't have to ask them. If you go to the Google Play Store, we have over 1,000 reviews of people we didn't solicit telling us what they thought about our app. Mostly it's good things, it's great, but it's always things for you to improve. So thinking about the user is almost revolutionary when you think about emerging markets or Africa, because everyone's thinking about kind of taking what works here and just planning it there, but having a conversation and a feedback with people who actually use it is revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. So on that vein of thinking about your users, do you have a sense in the different domains you work in about what technologies dominate in terms of things that, whether it's a business or students or just a general consumer, what technologies kind of dominate in the different markets you're working with?
Yeah, I can start. Like finance, obviously, is one big one on the continent right now. So like, like we rightfully alluded to now, is access to loans can easily be, captured, within like 5 minutes. As long as you have the right things plugged into a phone, you can easily get access to, a loan. There's a huge play going on the continent, in Nigeria specifically, on credit scoring. And Ghana, a lot of the big credit rating agencies around the world, especially the Experian, the TransUnions of the world, are also looking at those markets. So, access to capital, very, very big, and then decision making with the data they're being able to capture in that little markets they've created from the loans being provided has also been very, very big for us. It's more or less like, how do you continue to help the end customer of, saving capital and having more cash flow. So we have access to a lot of interesting data sets, I would say. And the inference we can make from those data sets, I would say, is at a 95% confidence level. So it's very reliable information, and we can predict people's behavior with that. So our focus is, how do we leverage those data points for good and continue to move the frontiers of people's personal finance forward.
I'll say, not because I'm here, but Android is a very important technology. I forget the source, but apparently over 80% of people on the African continent access their internet through an Android device. That includes laptops and all of those other things. So that's pretty dominant. Social media is also a very important technology because of how people use it. So a lot of people use Twitter to replace text messaging to save on data and rates on the continent. So social and Android definitely.
Sure. So I would say, since I'm focused on like a data science academy, there are a lot of trends in data. So, I mean, Greg knows with like big data, machine learning, AI, those are things that we're trying to prepare our students to thrive in. I'm the head of partnerships, and we're just getting to the point where our students have learned enough that they want some real world experience. And so there's so many startups on the continent. I mean, Esusu is one, Asoko is another, that work with data that can really leverage our students to do more. There's a company in Congo. It's called Stats Congo, and they use data to better predict health outcomes for women and children. We're working with another one in Nigeria called Ubenwa, and they're using machine learning to detect babies' cries to prevent SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So I mean, there's so many tech startups already moving in that direction, and that's why we're trying to prepare students to be able to work in those fields so they're not always outsourcing talent from the continent.
Just on that point, I think what's so interesting about Africa, because of all the challenges, is the innovation. I just met somebody on my last trip who used the same technology behind Shazam to detect tuberculosis. Right, like, which is very interesting.
Kenyan young dude.
Yeah.
Good friend.
You hear these stories all the time, right? I would say yes. Trend-wise, I'm always envious when I hear people in the fintech space, Abby, talking about the machine learning and the AI on the retail side, because there's so much data available and you're seeing so much consumer spending habits. It's very hard to do that on the business side because you don't have a single point of payment that you're able to analyze. So what's interesting for us as our next phase of growth is, can we cross-reference all sorts of signals to create a credit score for a company without access to their financial information? And this is something that we're continuously looking at, based on what sector they're in, what region, the age of their, the quality of their shareholders, et cetera. So that's something that we're looking at. More specifically in the now, we use Neo4j, and the ability to connect different entities on a database, particularly for private companies and owners in Africa. We've probably built the most comprehensive ecosystem of related entities across East and West Africa. So if you were to look at Aliko Dangote, for example, on our database, we've organically learned about all of the different corporate affiliations that he has based on the different local companies and entities that we've profiled independently. So this technology has become very useful for us.
Okay, so looking within these walls of Google, right, that we're sitting in Google, many global tech companies, Google included, like to or aim to build for everybody. Right? So it's something which we talk about a lot, something which we strive for. Just based on your experience, through your perspective, do you see a gap between that goal and the way products are actually being received in the African market from these global tech companies?
It's a very good question. I think to start off, I would really underscore Michael said. Android has probably contributed significantly, to the ecosystem from a finance perspective and data capture. What it has been able to do, especially in low data phones, has been, in my opinion, revolutionary. And the data we have access to is, thanks in big part to what the Android technology has been able to do. I think we need to take it, when we think about gaps, we need to take it, a step further.
Two steps.
Well, I think we can really build technologies, especially when you think about, what Google does with businesses. We can really build technologies that capture insights on SMEs. And then really helping them get access to capital. So I just imagine it's so where, you can capture financial data. So you can leverage a Flutter Wave in Nigeria, for example, across the continent, to capture pertinent data on a business and look at their cash flow, look at their balance sheets, look at their weekly performance. Let's get to that granular level and understand the propensity to get access to capital. And if we're able to do that, we're able to unlock a lot of capital that's not there right now, and that business can thrive. And when that business thrives, right, they can hire a bunch of people on the continent, and we stop blaming the government, although the government does have a role to create the environment. But that's how we need to think strategically. There's a phase in going to creating consumer products, albeit fantastic, but we need to still understand, the ecosystem of our capital flow. We need creators, so businesses that have taken the first step to, take that leap of faith. How do we support them? I think Google can play a quintessential role creating technologies that gets pertinent data from the small businesses on the tipping point, get them access to capital, and then, explore their businesses and give them more opportunities to hire more people, which in turn turns tax dollars for the government. There's a step further in terms of what the government does with that capital. That's a discussion for another day. But that's what we need to focus on. And if Google can play, a role in creating that kind of technology, it's a lot of initial capital investments for small venture-backed startups like us, but I think Google can play a big role in that.
I think you can definitely build for everyone if you include everyone in the building, right? So one of the reasons Android is so dominant is because it's open, right? And people could just build what they needed to build on that platform. I mean, that's how we got started. My co-founder built that app himself and could put it in the Google Play Store without friction, and people could just use it, right? And that approach can work across the world. So as long as you include everyone in the building process, you can build for everyone. If you don't, there'll always be a gap.
So I would say that there just needs to be some strategic vision when it comes to the continent to see the opportunity. Google's invested already on the continent, but if you look at what some of the top Chinese companies are doing, if you look at Huawei and how come it's become so pervasive, the phones are designed for the local context in Africa. You can put in multiple SIM cards because sometimes one of the telcos goes out and you need to use the other one. They understand this. It understands darker complexions, which American manufacturers don't. It has Swahili. And so from looking at this, there's a reason why, and it's obviously very cheap. In 20 or so years, I think you see these statistics all the time, Africa is going to be a quarter of the global population. This is the next story of consumerism in the world. So it's something that I believe I've been talking with the State Department for a while now on the initiatives under Trump about what he'll be doing in Africa, and it's still just not a top priority. And so I think, the government talking about a few different things now, but overall in corporate America, it's not a strategic priority to focus on this market, and it's getting there, but very slowly. So it's a question of when this becomes a strategic priority.
And to go to Michael's point, you said in order to build for everyone, everyone needs to be building. And so for everyone to be building, they have to have those skills. They have to have those digital skills. They have to know different languages. And again, like that comes with the education and the skills building and making sure that Africa, which has the youngest population in the world, has people who are able to build what they need.
Great. Well, fortunately, we have a room full of builders here at Google who can open up the floor now for anybody with questions for our panelists. And we can also go to the Dory if there are any questions on the Dory.
So the topic of China just came up. Lots of questions there. So I think China increasingly is finding a market in Africa, both for consumer products, phones, clothing, et cetera, but also for large-scale like infrastructure projects. And recently seeing a Chinese company partner up with the government in Zimbabwe to help with facial recognition for use of government purposes. Is there a conversation happening currently around consumer protection, citizen protection of data? Like, for example, in the US, San Francisco just banned facial recognition technology for use by city agencies, so for the police department, et cetera. Is that a concern currently? And is that, as people who are kind of innovating in this space, is that a topic being had, or a conversation being had currently?
I mean, if I go first, to be honest, I have not heard that in the conversation. I think that's probably a concern that comes up after certain infrastructure is really put into place. So I'm sure it will be a concern soon. But right now, Chinese money is very welcome. And I think the question is just what are the terms on that money is the debate. So that's my short answer to that question.
Yeah, like I've done a lot of research on China-Africa at work, and it's interesting now it's brought to the limelight. China-Africa engagements actually started the full boom in 2000 under the FOCAC agreement, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and then they have this biannual conversations and that's when they talk about the investments going on the continent. When we think about data, I think Uganda has done a very good job in terms of creating their, the equivalent of what you call the, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and then really thinking about being even a step further, thinking about blockchain and how that, will play a big role in the landscape. But when I think about data protection, that's why it's very, very important for us as entrepreneurs, as innovators, not to just go into the landscape and think about consumer products or business products. We need to work concomitantly with the government to help them, think through privacy, consumer protection, and then what big data is going to do. Because it's scary. Eventually, we're going to have data, computers talking to each other, and that's how they do transactions. We already seen stuff like that and currently do that today, but we need to work alongside the institutions to help them curate the right laws. It shouldn't be a copy and paste approach. It should really be ideographic rules and regulation that can really help propel those economies forward without other forces having a different agenda.
Yeah, putting my journalist cap on, I've had a lot of conversations with people concerned about this issue and know it very well in emerging markets, particularly on the African continent. And it's not a welcome conversation with a lot of people in government. I mean, there are governments who turn off the internet in parts of the country sometimes as a precaution around elections, sometimes as punishment. It's definitely a conversation that needs to be had, sometimes with government, but definitely with people. I don't think people understand what's going on and the effects of it and the dangers. So we should all be having this conversation.
I guess my follow-on is, who is concerned about privacy? You know, where do the concerns come from? Where do you see the gaps, and who do you think should be concerned?
Well, journalists are definitely concerned. It's a big issue, particularly how governments are leveraging it on people. In emerging markets, there's another layer of how independent businesses are using this and whether people really understand their privacy. I think the best reported stuff is probably around WhatsApp and what's going on in India in those elections. But in journalist circles, we're definitely talking about it. A lot of people don't want to talk to us about it, though.
Yeah. I think I can say something on financial technology, and it's tough. You know, we had an investor, which obviously I won't name, that offered an interesting proposition that said, oh, you just capture fingerprints and, you know, a whole bunch of, you know, data, and we're going to give you capital to do that, and just give freebies for people to supply you that data without, you know, what we call the caveat emptor, buyers beware of what's actually going on. You know, we decide to, you know, say no to that kind of draconian capital, in my opinion. But the concerns of what's going on right now, especially in places like Kenya, whereby you have what I like to call neo-payday loan lenders, whereby you tap a button and you get five minutes, you get a loan, and then you don't have education on exactly the ramifications of that loan, right? Is it going to be reported to TransUnion, Experian, or, you know, Equifax? And what does that do to your credit ratings? And how long does that stay on your record, right? That conversation is not being had, which is utterly frustrating. Everyone is thinking about the short term, which is access to capital, but not the financial health of the individuals. And it's quite sad. The governments also are just very excited about growth, you know, but there's a fundamental difference if we build, you know, these institutions under a sinking sand, or we should build it on a solid foundation. And that's the conversation we need to have. You know, if we want to build a doghouse, let's build it very well before we graduate to the White House. But right now we're building in a very, very fancy institution under a sinking sand, in my opinion, from a data privacy perspective.
Mm-hmm. And just from me, from conversations I've had with startup founders, since there isn't really government regulation around it yet, it is incumbent on the startup founder to use their moral code to figure out, you know, how much is too much. Because the consumer, especially if the consumer is maybe in a rural area, isn't educated, they don't care either way, or they don't know to care. And so a lot of the onus does fall on the startup founders in how to model it.
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of African countries have the real opportunity to draft legislation that's a lot more in line with a lot of discussion right now is importing the GDPR standards from Europe, and it's such misguided policies within that framework, and it should not be imported to a variety of other countries. So I just agree that the conversation needs to be a higher priority, and that you know, entrepreneurs need to keep. That's one of the fun things about being an entrepreneur on the continent, is you're also a lobbyist. So you need to push the government as hard as you are building your business. Yeah.
Why do you think that people across the continent of Africa are engaging with local news? Is sort of what I'm wondering, because I think, well, at least in the more developed countries, there's more of a pullback in terms of only looking at the global context rather than the local context. And I'm sort of wondering what that means, for ZNews, I guess in particular, what that means in terms of how you view engagement or monetization, or sort of the business of the app itself.
Can you repeat the first question? What about local news?
Why do you think people are engaging more with local news rather than here, for example, where you only companies of repute are New York Times or Washington Post?
Yes, so I would argue all people care about local news. We just take for granted how much local news we have access to here. So media in this country is ubiquitous. It's just everywhere for us, whether it's on television or our phones or on a paper or people talking about it. It's just there, right? But in other parts of the world, it's just not that easy to know what's going on, right? Or to get that context. The reason local news in particular is salient on the continent is because a lot of mainstream news is still dominated by, so the quote unquote most trusted news source in Africa is CNN, right? So it's people who are not who are not you telling you what's going on in the world, telling you what's going on in your country. So people are more interested in what their own people are saying about the news. It's really that simple.
This question might be most relevant to Greg, but I know that when you spoke earlier about how Ghana, and I believe you mentioned Uganda, were doing better in terms of trying to aggregate data, better than Nigeria, for instance. And I know that the Nigerian government started this ideal of doing the ease of, like an action plan for ease of doing business. And I'm curious about whether or not the problem stems in the legislation or execution. And then in alignment with what you do you work directly with businesses, or are you partnering with like the national, I know that there is a national ministry to collect data, for instance. Like, where is your data coming from and what are the roadblocks? And because I think we've talked about this so many times when it comes to Africa, the data is so sparse and expensive. But where exactly do we go in to address the problem? Is it with the businesses directly? Is it with the legislation? Where is the problem?
Sure. So I guess a few parts. One is, depending on how much central control a government has, is how efficient these solutions can be. I think that's where we're at the stage right now. So in a place like Nigeria, there's a will from certain stakeholders to do certain types of solutions, to centralize a repository and then to make it transparent for the global business environment. But certain stakeholders have vested interests, and it becomes a very difficult process to just build a solution. So we've been talking with folks for a long time, and things have just stalled, for example. So that, that's in a particular country like Nigeria, but there are certain areas where there is momentum. In a place like Rwanda, it's a different type of a government, right? You have Kagame, who has significant authority over everything that happens, and he makes a decision, and the decision gets executed. So these are the types of dynamics that make it pretty simplistic. With regards to how we collect the data, so we have to unlock any type of silo that there is. So certain government agencies will have data, and if they're willing to share it, then we would collect it. We'll also buy data from private entities, commercial entities, where we'll have arrangements with third-party researchers who will have that information, and then certain civil society organizations as well. So the idea is that anywhere where there is information, we want to be able to get access to it. So I think the answer is, without saying a cop-out, it's both. There needs to be the regulatory governmental push, and I think that is fundamental. But you do need to have innovation coming from the private sector that understands how to navigate these types of environments to get to a solution, because the government won't solve it on its own. And you can see from just the crops of entrepreneurs that are coming up who are looking at these problems, the governments understand that they need to work with them if they want to do anything efficiently. So yeah.
What do you see the impact of the African Union in terms of there's a new African Union passport, there's a new EU-like economic arrangement to have transnational business and things like that. What do you see the impact of that in terms of identity regulation and how it's going to affect tech and Africa's perspective to orchestrate the tech market and compete globally? That's one. To Greg, there's also a cultural context in most part of Africa, maybe specifically for Nigeria, whereby we don't like to share data. So we all know that in Nigeria, it's assumed that the world's richest black man is Aliko Dangote, but we all know that there are people that are richer than Aliko Dangote in Nigeria. Because why? People keep the money and don't say anything. So how do you navigate that, whereby it's a taboo to share, especially financial knowledge or information or data or stats, even within enterprises?
I can take the second part, and then I think, Michael, probably best for you to take the first part. And this, I think, is incumbent upon the government, because it's true. Until there's an incentive in place to be transparent, there's no reason that a company should want to provide its data. You become a taxation target, and this is the implications on the continent right now. Why would you, if you're making money, the government is not supporting you in any way, right? Here, despite all of our opinions perhaps about government, there's an innate trust. When you pay your taxes, social services come to you. There's a whole variety of benefits that you have with that contract with government. And that's not the case in a number of African countries yet. And until there's a route to financing that becomes clear, companies will not feel the need to provide their data. And we learned this the hard way. We tried to just get companies to submit data, right? And the answer was no. So then we said, all right, why don't we provide, and we have a new product now called the Deal Book, where we say, look, if you provide us with your data, we will put you in front of global financiers that are looking to invest in Africa. And all of a sudden, we have thousands of companies providing us with data, right? So I think there's simple solutions that governments can put into place to show that, you know, if you formalize, and this is a whole other question with development, is the reason the informal sector is the way it is because there's more benefits to being informal. And so the government has a big role to play there. Yeah.
The first part was about the African Union or the passport. I mean, I'm optimistic about it. To me, probably the biggest thing that can happen in my lifetime on the African continent is African countries actually trading with each other. So hopefully that can come with travel, and there actually being direct travel routes and not having to fly to Europe to fly back to go to another country. It's insane, but that can be built through travel. I mean, we take it for granted here in the U.S. with 50 states, but a lot of that cohesion comes from having a highway system, right? So I mean, it's a step forward. We'll see 50 years from now what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think for African Union, we also need to see like digital identity, right? So now, imagine you have your credit score in Nigeria, you go to Uganda, and then you can borrow money against that. So that ability to be a convenient environment for data privacy, I think will be interesting to have a open data initiative curated by the African Union, and what that looks like. There's a lot of conversations that can be had. And that can be added, sequel to this conversation.
Yeah, I think there's a free trade agreement that was just negotiated, and it's going to take a long time before it has its full effects. But once it does, and hopefully it does, Africa becomes dangerous. I mean, that's when you unify the continent and have a full integrated trading system with the largest consumer base, and everybody can trade freely. I mean, then finally it becomes a story that it should be.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll take those two as the last two questions.
So I actually work on the Africa marketing team, so I'm coming to find you. But I'm just curious, so in terms of growing your user or customer base, whether it's a business or a consumer, I'm just wondering what you consider to be your single biggest challenge in reaching them, educating them, converting them.
I can take that. So for me, we are a B2C model right now. We've actually explored the B2B model, and we did go into, investment banks in Lagos, tech companies, and we gave them the pitch, and we said, we want to train the women in your companies to level up, and then let's meet your data team. There are no women on the data team. Let's meet your IT team. No women. So it goes from a problem of just thinking that you can have this educational product to actually then building an entire talent pipeline, and then teaching people, or like through diversity and inclusion training, explaining why you should have women on data teams and women in IT. But as much as that is a challenge, in order for us to scale, it's also an opportunity, because you get to not just create this product that sits on its own, or offer this singular service, but you're now creating a system, right? And that's what's so great about innovating on the African continent. So now if we design a talent pipeline, once our students graduate and we're placing them in companies, we're able to help them negotiate better salaries. We're able to inform what it means to be a woman in the workforce in tech, and that's amazing. And so as much as it's difficult right now when we're still trying to figure out how to scale up, especially because of the financial constraints of our consumers, there's so many different ways that we can go and so much more that we can do.
Yeah, I think two things. We do a lot of growth hacking, and then trying as much as possible to offer incentives for people to sign up for stuff. But the B2C angle is still expensive because customer acquisition cost, regardless, B2C is just cost prohibitive. So one of the things we look at is actually working with B2B partners. So a classic example from a fintech play would be, majority of people have some sort of bank account or mobile money, partner with the telecommunication networks and the bank, provide some sort of value proposition for them, and then you have a huge market penetration. Those conversations do take a lot of time, but it's better to allocate your capital in building those right relationships so you can have a good foundation. So that's number one. Number two, I continue to drill down on this. Working with institutions matter. I have been involved in my previous company where I worked for over a decade in the water space, which our company was eventually acquired by a government, and they are running good operations when it comes to infrastructure now. I'm really working alongside these institutions and showing them ultimately it is in your best interest and there won't be political instability if you do invest in working with innovators. So there's one piece telling them what is in need for them and helping them create the right structure. So if you're interested in doing business on the continent, you need to be a curator or, like Greg said, be a lobbyist that help people write certain bills in some cases. But your main agenda is how do we move the frontiers of the country forward, number one, and then your business will thrive in that regard also.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what both of them said, that people have to be a part of whatever campaign that you're using. It cannot be completely digital in Africa. That's true. Yeah.
How developed would you say the field of user experience is in Africa? What processes are in place? What processes do you take to make sure that your products that you're building are usable both locally and globally? And how easy is it to access user experience professionals, so user researchers, designers, and things like that? What does that look like currently?
Yeah, we build products so people can have access to. It's a fantastic question, and the reason why we had an expansion aggressively into the 3 countries we're going into now, and continue to work with their institutions because of a lot of demand from people. So folks are saying, how do I leverage this app, or how do I access it? What's the value proposition? And what we quickly did from a user sort of feedback standpoint and user design, and we gave them our technology and said, are you willing to be a tester? And then really capture user stories. Our product designers worked alongside them. But when we think about the ecosystem, there are tech companies that do curate that space, but they have the Andelas of the world, do supply technology. There's a good friend of mine runs a company called ThinkIt, based out of Tunisia. They do a lot of good work when it comes to user testing also. So there are these hubs, but you have to know folks to essentially have access to them. But it's still hard, and there's a huge market opportunity, especially for big companies going, talk to Asoko Insights. They tell you you're doing market entry, and then connect with them to have user experience, capture user stories to create ideographic products for folks that are actually in the in the particular country. I think it's a great market opportunity you've identified. Go do it.
Okay. Thank you, Greg, Eyitemi, Abby, Michael. We applaud you for all of your efforts. Thank you for sharing your insights with us, for taking your time to come and share with us today. Thank you, everybody, for engaging with us in this session. I hope it was useful. And it's a wrap.